Okay, so the plant life cycles, what are the plant life cycles that we come across is, so there is an alternation of generations. You find there is a sporophytic plant body and a gametophytic plant body. Sporophytic plant body, they produce spore, they produce spores, and usually it would be haploid spores. The gametophytic plant body, they produce gametes. Okay, so in case of bryophytes, we call it as anthrozoids. Male gamete is called as anthrozoids, and female gamete is the egg cell which is present within the archegonium. Okay, and in case of higher plants like in and angiosperms, the male gametophyte is the pollen grain, female gametophyte is the embryo sac. The entire plant body, the visible plant body is sporophyte. So what you notice here is in certain plants like bryophytes, which is unique to bryophytes, the gametophytic generation is dominant. So they are the most visible stage. So they are the dominant stage of this two cycle. And sporophyte is dependent upon this gametophyte, and they are found growing on the gametophyte. So they are dependent on the gametophyte for source of food, nutrition. So that sort of dependency is there. Whereas in case of pteridophytes, you come across gametophyte and sporophyte. The most dominant phase is sporophyte. They are independent. And gametophyte is also noticed. They are also independent. They are not dependent. They are independent, but they are reduced life stage. Whereas the sporophytic life phase is the dominant and most predominant life cycle of the pteridophytes. Similarly, in case of gymnosperms, the gametophyte is found attached to the sporophyte. Sporophytic plant body is dominant. See, in pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, sporophytic plant body is dominant. And the gametophyte in pteridophytes is independent. They are not dependent upon the uh, sporophyte. That is one unique thing. Whereas in case of the gametophytes are found on the sporophytes in case of the gymnosperms and angiosperms. See, the pollen grains are present within the anther of the sporophytic plant body, isn't it? And the egg is found within the ovule, uh, which is present on the plant body, that is sporophytic plant body. So they are reduced, but they are dependent on the gametophytic plant body. So that is what you should analyze with whatever groups that we have studied. Okay, keeping these points in mind, we'll be studying about the life cycle and alternation of generations. So we find that the different types of life cycle, in some of the life cycle, the haploid stage is dominant. So we call it as haplontic life cycle. In some of the life cycles, the diploid stage is dominant. So we call it as Diplontic life cycle. In some of the stages, both haploid and diploid stages are equally important. So we call it as Haplodeplotic life cycle. So let us study about this life cycles and alternation of generation. So what you notice here is in plants, both the haploid and diploid cells, they can divide by mitosis. Okay, they form haploid and diploid plant bodies. So the haploid plant body, gametophyte, they produce gametes by mitosis. Okay, the haploid plant body or gametophyte is produced by gametes by mitosis. And the after fertilization, the zygote also divides by mitosis to produce diploid plant body sporophyte. Okay, this produce haploid spores. Sporophyte always produces haploid spores that you should be aware about. And these spores divide by mitosis to form a haploid plant body. So this is noticed here. So in plants, both haploid and diploid cells, they can divide by mitosis. So this forms haploid and diploid plant bodies. So haploid plant body, gametophyte, they produce gametes by mitosis. After fertilization, the zygote, it is diploid, isn't it? So this Diploid zygote, they also divide by mitosis to produce diploid plant body, that is sporophyte. So once sporophyte are formed, so within the sporangium they produce spores, but these spores are haploid. How did the diploid sporophyte produce haploid spores? By meiosis. So spores divide by mitosis to form a later spores divide by mitosis to form a haploid gametophytic plant body. Thus, during the life cycle of any sexually reproducing plant, there is alternation of generation. So there is an alternation of generation between gametophyte, which is haploid, and sporophyte, which is diploid. So there is a so the haploid condition we always represent by n, and diploid condition we write it by 2n. Haploid means single set of chromosomes. Diploid means two set of chromosomes would be there. See, we are human beings. We have diploid set of chromosomes that we have is 46. So 46 chromosomes means haploid would be 23 chromosomes. So we have two set of chromosomes. So diploid, and our chromosomal number is 2n equals 46. Haploid, if it is there, n equals 23 chromosomes. So remember this example. N indicates haploid, 2n indicates diploid. So you should be knowing about the symbols which represent haploid or diploid. So gametophytic plant bodies are all haploid, N, and sporophytic plant bodies are all 2N. So you have to remember. Okay. But sporophyte, even though it's a diploid, they produce haploid spores by meiosis. Gametophyte, they produce by mitosis, they produce the haploid gametes. Okay, so the spores after fertilization, the zygote is diploid. You know that they develop to form the sporophyte. The diploid sporophyte produces haploid gametes, and these haploid gametes, uh, haploid spores, sorry, these haploid spores develop to form male gametophyte and female gametophyte plants. So there is an alternation of generation between sporophytic generation, which is diploid, and gametophytic generation, which is haploid. So the patterns of plant life cycles. So there are three patterns of plant life cycle: haplontic, diplontic, and haplodeplotic life cycle. So there are three patterns of plant life cycle: haplontic, diplontic, and haplodeplotic life cycle. Okay, so in haplontic life cycle, you should draw such diagrams. See, there is very much small stages there for this, the haploid phase. So in the entire life cycle, predominant is what? So the haplontic, so the haploid stage is predominant. Okay, in case of algae, so you notice this sort of haplontic life cycle. Diplontic life cycle is after the formation of zygote 2n, they undergo meiosis to form spores. So this is reduced stage of zygote is the only diploid stage, whereas all of them are haploid stage. Okay. In this, sporophytic generation is represented only by the zygote. Immediately, the zygote undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores, and they divide mitotically to form gametophyte. So the sporophyte in case of haplontic life cycle is seen only in the zygote stage. Okay. The dominant photosynthetic phase is the gametic, free living gametophyte. So just take the examples here. The spores, haploid spores, they germinate to form male and female gametophyte. So they undergo gametogenesis. Gametophyte, which is haploid, they undergo gametogenesis. That is by mitosis. They produce male gamete, female gamete. So these two fuse, we call it as syngamy. Male and female gamete fuse or undergo fertilization, and that process is called as syngamy. So that product of syngamy is diploid zygote. See, sporophytic plant body is only shown in the zygote stage. So the sporophyte plant body is only seen in zygote stage 2n. Immediately zygote undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores. So it is the zygote is the only sporophytic generation. Zygote undergoes meiosis to form haploid spores. They divide mitotically to form The spores divide mitotically to develop into the gametophytic plant. The dominant photosynthetic phase is the free living gametophyte. Examples for these are algae such as volvox, spirogyra, and chlamydomonas are example of this gametophytic. Uh, these sort of haplontic life cycle you can notice in examples you should remember volvox, spirogyra, and chlamydomonas. They exhibit this haplontic life cycle. So almost all of them are the algae form. Volvox is the colonial form. Spirogyra is the uh, filamentous form. Chlamydomonas, so the unicellular form. So all these variety of algae they exhibit this haplontic life cycle, and sporophyte is highly reduced. That is why the most dominant phase here is haplontic life cycle. Sporophyte is reduced to only the zygote stage. Okay. The second type of life cycle, that is diplontic life cycle, the major part of the life cycle of this plant is they are in diploid stage and highly reduced gametophytic stage you find. So the haploid stage is highly reduced. So only in the gamete condition they are haploid, and immediately they undergo fusion to form diploid. Okay. See what you notice in this particular stage is, so the diplontic stage, the diploid sporophyte is the dominant photosynthetic and independent phase. Gametophytic phase is represented by the single to few celled haploid gametes. Only here the haploid condition is there. Immediately they fuse to form diploid zygote. Okay, so the gametophytic phase is represented by the single to few celled haploid gametophyte. So the gametes represent the gametophytic phase. Example, algae like fucus, all seed-bearing plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms. The gametophytic phase is few to multi-celled. Okay, so the gametes represent the gametophyte there. So in the pollen grain, I told you that pollen grain, mature pollen grain is the male gametophyte, mature embryo sac is the female gametophyte. So they are reduced. So the sporophytic plant body is dominant photosynthetic and independent phase. Gametophytic phase is represented by single to few celled haploid gametophytes. Example for this is fucus algae. Then there is also example of gymnosperm and angiosperms, the gametophytic phase. So they are diplontic life cycle you can notice in fucus, gymnosperm, and angiosperm. Okay, so the gametophytic phase is few to multi-cell. Then the third type of life cycle is haplodiplotic. Almost they have equal stages in haplodiplotic. You can notice this haplodiplotic life cycle in case of bryophytes and pteridophytes. So it is the intermediate condition. So haplodiplotic life cycle is an intermediate condition between haplontic and diplontic life cycle. So both the gametophyte and sporophyte, they are multicellular. So both the gametophyte and sporophyte, they are multicellular. So and often free living. See the except for bryophytes where the sporophyte is dependent on gametophyte. In pteridophytes, they are free living. So they have a different dominant phases. Okay. Example, bryophytes and pteridophytes. You find that the both the life cycles of gametophyte and sporophyte, uh, it is equally seen. It is an intermediate condition between haplontic and diplontic life cycle. So the sporophytic phase from the zygote to sporophyte, still the formation of spores is the sporophytic phase. Gametophytic phase is from the haploid spores to the development of gametophyte and formation of gametes. So this phase represents the gametophytic phase, and they are the haploid stage. So haploid phase and diploid phase, we can notice they are equal. So haplodiplontic is an intermediate condition between haplontic and diplontic life cycle. Both the gametophyte and sporophyte are multicellular and they are often free living, like in case of pteridophytes. But in case of bryophytes, sporophyte is dependent on gametophyte that you are aware of. So they have different dominant phases like diploid and haploid dominant phases. They are almost equally distributed. Example for haplodeplotic life cycle is bryophytes and pteridophytes are the example for this haplodiplotic life cycle. Okay, so with this, this completes our complete discussion of this topic of plant kingdom. Okay, so do you have any doubts